This talk is really rooted in a belief that things, and especially furniture, provide a particularly rich window into our world. After all, the cabinet maker is involved in all aspects of our life. The baby needs a cradle, the dead require a coffin, and in between there are the chests, the chairs, the desks, and the other objects that make up the furniture of our everyday lives. And of course, the many choices made by a cabinet maker and a consumer about form, style, materials, construction, decoration. These all reveal aspects of the past. Objects are the result of people, place, and time. And they tell stories about settlement and migration, race and ethnicity, and religion, of course. And most importantly for us in this talk, they reveal how different people came together in a particular place to create new styles for what would become a new nation. Now, this was the Virginia that Alexander Spotswood knew. It was a Virginia that was bordered to the west and the south, by various native peoples, as well as, quote, the Spanish parts of Florida. Now, this may seem surprising to people who study American decorative arts and tend to think very much as America as just the United States of America, but it's important to remember that Virginia was just a small part of early America. Even the British colonies were just a tiny part of the Americas. We often forget that objects like this desk and bookcase made in Mexico were being made at the exact same time as this high chest being made in Boston. Now, during the first century of Virginia's settlement, the Blue Ridge and Appalachian Mountains presented a kind of barrier to Virginia's westward expansion. They also provided defense both against native peoples who were unhappy about their lands being taken from them, but also other European powers, the French and the Spanish, who did not particularly want the British interfering in the New World. And so Governor Spotswood and Virginia's colonial government really had two goals in crossing the Blue Ridge and settling the Shenandoah Valley. Obviously, they were interested in securing Virginia's western border, but once they had done that, they realized that they were also incredibly interested in the economic opportunities this fertile valley had to offer. During Virginia's first century as an English colony, first established in 1607, it really proceeded to move first up to the fault lines. Now, this is because of how land was distributed and also the agricultural implications of tobacco cultivation. Moving first to the point where the rivers were navigable to the sea, and then because tobacco was so draining on the land, continuing to need to clear new land. That then continued up to the Blue Ridge Mountains by the time Spotswood and his associates crossed them. And this is sort of critical to think about also as families expand and divide land, this need to continue clearing new land. And once again, I think it's incredibly important that we remember this land that I've shaded here was not empty. It was home to large numbers of native people who were dispossessed of their homelands and hunting grounds as tobacco cultivation just swallows up huge tracts of the Tidewater and then the Piedmont. Now, of course, Virginians were not the only ones who were hungry for land and were actively seizing it by any means possible. For example, in 1681, Charles II grants the province of Pennsylvania to Wm Penn, and Penn, of course, founds Pennsylvania. And he does so on the then radical notion of religious tolerance. I bring Philadelphia into this because it's going to play a major role in how the Valley of Virginia is settled and why it really becomes this American crucible. Philadelphia's rapid growth and economic success were as much a result of its geographic location as it was towards its liberal stance towards not only religion, but also the ethnic and cultural diversity that came with it, or at least the ethnic and cultural diversity as it applied to white Protestant European men. And this 1761 map of Philadelphia really gives you an idea of that kind of diversity that I'm speaking of. It actually lists out all of the various religious houses of worship. We have St. Peter's Church, Quakers Meeting House, the Popish Church, Popish Chapel, St. Paul's Church, Presbyterians, Quaker Meeting House again, Christ Church, Anabaptists. There's Moravian Meeting House. The Jews do not yet have a synagogue, but they will very shortly in Philadelphia. And the settlement of Pennsylvania is really a result of initial land grants to a number of families that are then parceled out and divided among subsequent generations, which works just fine for a generation or two. But by the time you're the third son of the third son, your land opportunities are pretty limited. And so what we see happening is this sort of migration in waves out from Philadelphia as third sons of third sons begin to look for their own land. And so really, for both the Pennsylvanians and the Virginians, that desire to continue acquiring land really meets in the Shenandoah Valley. It solves two problems at once, actually, for both groups. It provides a buffer against Native American and European powers, and it also provides new land and economic opportunities. And it is the Great Wagon Road, the road that goes from Pennsylvania and Philadelphia really all the way to Augusta, Georgia, that this transmission of style occurs. The Great Wagon Road is, in many ways, America's first superhighway. It is not so much a road in the modern sense of like a highway as much as it's a series of trails that lead from Philadelphia south through the Shenandoah Valley and then into Piedmont, North Carolina, where I am, and then all the way through state South Carolina, and ultimately to Augusta, Georgia. And to reuse an old metaphor, while some people are crossing the mountains, are following Spotswood's track and are going directly into the Shenandoah Valley, many, many more are entering it through the Port of Philadelphia and coming down the valley. Though I need to pause for a moment and explain a little bit of nomenclature. The Shenandoah Valley is, of course, drained by the Shenandoah River, which flows from the south to the north. And so when I speak of going up the valley, I'm actually talking about going south. And when I speak about going down the valley, I'm actually talking about going north towards Philadelphia. It's very confusing. So just bear that in mind. This road is also, and this is important for our story this afternoon, is also a kind of major north-south trunk line that then intersects with other historic roads like the Wilderness Trail towards the Cumberland Gap and off into places like Tennessee and Kentucky and the Trans-Appalachian West. In some ways, we can sort of take that Euphrates metaphor and the Fertile Crescent metaphor and even push it one step further and talk about it being both a Fertile Crescent and a Silk Road, a place that really unites multiple cultures together. Now, as we think about the Great Wagon Road and its route all the way through, we should also keep in mind that the larger story of American history really travels along it. Virtually everybody who is impacted by the settlement of the United States at some point walks along this route, whether it's native peoples being dispossessed, whether it's enslaved individuals being marched from one place to another. This is America's road and it's America's story. And so as we look first to the valley, we really get a sense of how these different people all come together. The specific circumstances of land ownership and value, and of course, the relative desirability of access to both Philadelphia and the Chesapeake ports really tends to define the broader settlement patterns we see in the valley. For example, we tend to see Quakers in the northern part of the valley. We tend to see German-speaking Lutherans in the middle, and we tend to see Scotch-Irish Presbyterians down at the southern end. Now, somewhat unique in this whole process is something called the Fairfax Grant, and it's a vast 5 million acre grant issued in 1649 by the exiled Charles II. Now, of course, it didn't mean much in 1649 when he was in exile, but when Charles II came back, it became very, very valuable. And this grant really causes that Quaker settlement to be in that northern part. By the early 1730s, Quakers are settling in the northern part of the valley. We see early construction of meeting houses like the Hopewell Friends Meeting House outside of Winchester here. The structure established in 1734, begun in 1759. And it's important to recognize that the organization of the Quaker religion really has a lot to do with how the Quakers relate to the larger world. After all, Quaker meetings are organized into weekly, monthly, and yearly meetings, and this means that Quakers are in constant communication with one another across different communities. And it's also worth noting, Quakers are not homogenous. They were English, Welsh, and Scots-Irish in origins, and of course, because of that, they're bringing their own regional furniture traditions with them into the valley. One typical story is that of David Lupton, whose father and grandfather moved from Bucks County, Pennsylvania, along the Great Wagon Road into the Shenandoah Valley in the 1740s, ultimately amassing something like 1,700 acres and erecting grist mills and sawmills. Now, after his father's death in 1791, David Lupton begins construction on a substantial brick house on Apple Pie Ridge, and this is that house. It's a phenomenal house owned by wonderful friends of mine to this day and lovingly preserved. This was a $5,000 house in 1791. So this is a really significant architectural gesture, and I think Lupton knows that. The house is built to last. Lupton's initials and the date of completion are actually inset into the gable end. And of course, he doesn't skimp when it comes to the furniture. Here are 3 surviving pieces of furniture. Well, 2 of these surviving pieces of furniture from the house that are now in the collection of Colonial Williamsburg, some of my favorite objects, as well as one of, I think, 2 surviving corner cupboards that are still in the house today. And this is when you can read a lot more about this in this really important article by Sumter Priddy and Joan Quinn in the journal American Furniture. And I think it's available on their website at chipstone.org. You can also learn a lot more about Quaker settlement and cabinet making in the valley if you want to take a look at our MESDA journal, mesdajournal.org. This is an article by a good friend of mine, a curator in Winchester at the Museum of the Shenandoah Valley, Nick Powers, about Quaker furniture makers in the northern Shenandoah Valley. Now, there are a number of ways to look at an object like the Lupton family high chest. Given the restrained ornamentation, later date of the Lupton high chest, we could simply argue that it represents Lupton's conservative Quaker values, though I would point out that some of the most elaborate Philadelphia carved furniture there is was originally commissioned for Quakers. So maybe we overstate Quaker simplicity a little bit. We could also argue that this is a somewhat naive and stripped down interpretation of the Philadelphia Rococo High Chest. With its slightly different proportions, attenuated legs, narrower bottom section, and taller top. Notice also how the ball and claw feet, they all face forward as opposed to forward and backwards. But what I would actually say is, given its date, that it's really a neoclassical object, not a Rococo object. And it's unfair to compare this to the earlier Philadelphia object because it's really a neoclassical adaptation of this Rococo form. It's lighter, it's more refined, it's more attenuated. And I'll also add, if you go beyond the surface, these objects from the Lupton family collection, now at Williamsburg, they are impeccably constructed. These are not rural cabinet work with a veneer of sort of sophistication on them. These are incredibly well-constructed objects with their wonderful attenuated cabriole legs and block feet, with their engaged quarter columns, and of course with this really delicate tympanum at the top. Now, in 1997, noted furniture scholar Wallace Gusler wrote at length about these objects in American furniture, and talks about them likely being the work of James Lee Marden and Christopher Fry. And I'm not going to get into the attribution of these objects for a moment, because I think what matters less in this moment, at this moment, I think what matters less is the exact attribution than it does thinking about them in sort of a linguistic way, as regional style, and how they are, as a pair of objects, as the center of a constellation of similar things, representative of a larger regional vocabulary embraced by craftsmen and consumers over a number of generations. And here are just a couple of close-up details of these things that are really quite wonderful. It's a vocabulary that is rooted in origins of these craftspeople in Philadelphia, of course, and in Europe in some cases, but also one that evolves over time because of people and place, and also one that we should not minimize the role of the Chesapeake in as well. I mean, this is a great image of the junction of the Potomac and the Shenandoah coming through the mountains. And then, of course, the various routes from Baltimore and other Chesapeake ports into the Shenandoah Valley. And there's incredibly sophisticated urban-looking furniture being made in Winchester, like this sideboard. It's heavily inlaid sideboard made in Frederick County, Virginia, which is Winchester, which is essentially where those last two pieces was made. And, you know, it's sophisticated urban neoclassical furniture in its form, in its decoration, even its material palette. I mean, this is mahogany and rosewood. This is not, you know, local woods being used instead. So these are people who have access to trade. Now, as we move further up the valley, we leave this region settled by Quakers, we leave the Fairfax Grant, and we end up in a region much more heavily settled by German-speaking Pennsylvania families. Now, remember that a key goal for Virginia in settling the Shenandoah Valley is to provide a buffer. And what they're looking for is, or are, strong Protestants, preferably non-Englishmen, who they can put there as sort of this sacrificial buffer between what is in the West and the Tidewater itself. And so Germans are perfect. German-speaking Lutherans are perfect. They're Protestant, they speak German, and unlike the Quakers, they will fight, which is important to the Virginians. And so as early as the 1740s, we see land speculators buying up land and very specifically targeting German immigrants, both those in Germany, but also those who are further up the valley. And the early houses they build are very much like this. This is Fort Egypt, is what it's called. So going back to that biblical metaphor in Page County, Virginia, and it is literally a fort. And if you look here, Ross's Spring, constructed in about 1740, by Quakers, and then Fort Egypt actually settled built about a decade later in Page County. You can sort of get a sense of how these two groups are approaching their role being on what was then a moving frontier. There's a wonderful observation from a 19th century author that if a German builds a house, the walls are twice as thick as others. If he puts down a gatepost, it is surely to be nearly as thick as it is long. He talks about, while fashion changes it may, his old oaken chest and clothes press of curled maple with the annodominy of their construction upon them still stand their ground while the baseless fabrics of fashion fade away. This idea of a Germanic stability and sort of a dislike of a fleeting fashion for things that are stable. And we do sort of see that in some of these objects. They are solidly constructed. When you think about the number of pegs used to attach the molding, the fact that the dovetails are wedged, not because the cabinet maker didn't cut them precisely, but because it makes them even stronger. The construction becomes the decoration. Even the hinges are decorative. This is celebrating solidity as ornament. We see, however, a flourishing of paint-decorated furniture as well within these German-speaking communities. This is a Fraktur, or a birth or baptism or marriage document by Jacob Strickler. And we see parallels when we look at the paint-decorated furniture of great masters like Johannes Spitler, who's in Page County in the 1790s. And I think a wonderful colleague of mine, Betsy Davison, is in fact working on a major book and exhibition on Spitler's work. It's really spectacular stuff. These are just a few more examples of his work. But we also see interesting regional quirky traditions coming out of Pennsylvania and into the valley, like the use of sulfur inlay, which is a technique where you actually carve out a channel as if you were going to inlay it with wood or metal, but instead you pour molten sulfur into it and plane off the excess, leaving decoration, often ornamental, but also very often relating to the commissioners of the piece and an important date. Oftentimes reflecting family relationships, sort of embedding genealogy into these objects. And in fact, we see that with the decoration as well. Here, a Shenandoah Valley sulfur inlaid blanket chest on the left and a Shenandoah Valley Fraktur on the right, both with these sort of hearts and tulips and urns involved in them. Now, it's worth also saying that these were not communities in isolation, that, German communities didn't stick to themselves. And this is what makes the valley such a fertile place. It's that you have these groups of people cheek by jowl at times. And so, for example, creating for someone like John Cyron, you have this sort of bilingual community going on. On the left, the Abraham Kagi chest, and then on the right, John Cyron, and you see misspelled, made April 2nd, 1793. So being both Germanic, but also English. Now, this final group are the Scotch-Irish. And this is a term that may be a little unfamiliar to my British colleagues. You would call them Ulstermen. These are Scottish, they're Irish settlers of Scottish descent, Protestants, Orangemen, who then leave Ireland and come to America. And they're Scots-Irish Presbyterians. We call them Scotch-Irish Presbyterians here. And they're incredibly important when it comes to the culture of the early American South. Now, they tend to settle initially in this area called Beverley Manor. It's a piece of land that's owned by the Beverley family. And you see actually on the Fry Jefferson map, it's called the Irish Tract because there's so many, because this is where they are settling. They're an intriguing group of people with a great deal of sort of cultural mythology surrounding them. For example, one of the earliest settlers in this region was a man named John Lewis of Ulster County, Ireland, who apparently decides to go to America after cleaving his landlord's skull in twain. And so he then realizes that he is very much a wanted man and needs to go as far away as possible, and finds the Shenandoah Valley might just be the place he's looking for. And so his family were among the earliest settlers in this region on this 100,000-acre tract owned by the Beverley family. Now, again, this is a group of people that is often maligned, most famous perhaps by the itinerant Anglican minister Charles Wood Mason, who calls them, and I quote, rude, ignorant, void of manners, education, or good breeding, no genteel or polite person among them, a set of the most lowest, vilest crew breathing, Scotch-Irish Presbyterians from the north of Ireland. And then he goes on great detail about how they fight among each other, gouging eyes, kicking each other in places I won't mention, biting off noses, etc. I will add, many of our most important institutions of learning, early education in the South, are founded by Scots-Irish Presbyterian intellectuals. So, but nonetheless, you would be correct to assume that this early furniture that they are making is simple, solid, and deeply conservative, like the armchairs, the armchair at the left, which is in MESDA's collection. I'm actually looking at just in the other gallery around the corner, and then the armchair on the right in the collection of Colonial Williamsburg's collection, and the collection of Colonial Williamsburg. They build churches like the Augusta Stone Church in 1747, and they keep great records of what they're doing. Now, the earliest documented cabinet maker in this region is a man named Joseph Ray. He follows this sort of quintessential path that we've talked about already, Philadelphia, down the Wagon Road, and by 1759, he's in Augusta County as an accomplished woodworker. And we know this is his path, and we know this because in 1759, he is appointed the superintendent of a company of artificers at Fort Ligonier in western Pennsylvania. This dressing table is one of the earliest objects made in Augusta County, Virginia. By history, it was owned by John Lewis and his family. Yes, the John Lewis of leaving twain his skull. And it reflects how rapidly that region becomes fairly sophisticated. We can also read this in shop records at the time. When we think about Joseph Ray and then those who follow him, we find a really sophisticated group of furniture, starting with the high chest on the left, made about 1765, and then seeing the style shift slightly through the clock in MESDA's collection, a high chest in Williamsburg's collection, and then this clock also at Colonial Williamsburg. Now, I'm particularly interested in this clock that we were able to acquire a number of years ago, because not only is the case likely by Ray, but it also tells a story of the clock maker, Wm Huston, who begins his career in Philadelphia, and then, you guessed it, goes down the Wagon Road, and then this example, Wm Huston, Augusta. Let's see, it's one of, I think three, I'm sorry, Wm Huston, his son is also a clockmaker as well. And so here you see work by James Huston in Colonial Williamsburg's collection. So back to that. Now, as I said, the Wagon Road is this great national artery because it also connects with the major east-west routes, including the Cumberland Road, here in blue, and then in green, you see the Wilderness Trail to the Cumberland Gap in green. And so when we begin to think about time and how these cabinet makers in the Shenandoah Valley move out, we see really the pivotal role that the Valley and the Wagon Road had to play. For example, here is a chest on chest from the Ray Price shop in Augusta County. And then here on the right, we see a corner cupboard by Moses Crawford, one of the earliest cabinet makers in Middle Tennessee. Sorry, not Middle Tennessee, he's in Knox County, so he's in East Tennessee. But notice how the tympanum is sort of enclosed, that these aren't sort of great leaping swan's necks, but rather are still sort of engaged with the tympanum below. Now, you can learn a lot more about Moses Crawford. In fact, Tracy Parks, a wonderful advisory board member of ours, wrote a journal article all about him and this corner cupboard. So, definitely learn more about him. It's well worth it to do so. What is indisputable, however, is that without provenance, and the Knox example, the Moses Crawford example is a great example of this, without provenance, it's almost impossible at times to differentiate things made on one end of the Wagon Road from another. For example, this high chest on frame on the left, attributed to Thos Pierce in Guilford County, North Carolina, and then a high chest on frame on the right to Virgil Akis of Chester County, Pennsylvania. And that's really the story that we told in this journal article by my predecessor as chief curator, Robert Leaf, looking at how David Osborne, a Quaker cabinet maker, really took a mixture of styles into a particular, from Quaker settlements in Nantucket and Pennsylvania, and then ultimately down into Guilford County, North Carolina, which is Greensboro, which is just to our east here at MESDA. We see that sort of itinerancy as well, and those interconnections of place with things like these Fraktur by the Ehre Vater artist. These are examples of the still anonymous artist's work from Pennsylvania, North Carolina, and South Carolina. And we can also see when we look at paint decorated blanket chests from Pennsylvania, Alamance County, North Carolina, Wythe County, Virginia, and down at the bottom, Walton County, Georgia. And were it not for the idiosyncrasies of particular artists and I cannot stress this enough, long histories of descent, it'd be incredibly difficult to tell these two apart from construction alone. They all have thickly planed boards, sturdy pegged and wedge dovetail construction, and of course, decorative ironwork. And as you move further in time and further along the Wagon Road, you also see convergences of traditions. For example, here on the left, we have a sulfur inlaid chest. On the left, we have a chest of drawers attributed to the Quaker cabinet maker Moses Pyle of Chester County, Pennsylvania, with this very distinctive line and berry wooden inlay. And here on the right, we have a chest of drawers by Quaker cabinet maker Joseph Wells. So similar, except Wells, working on a commission for one of his German-speaking neighbors, has employed sulfur, not wooden decoration on it. We can see it across other cultures as well. Here is a chair from north central Georgia with a very continental Germanic design. And my colleague Dale Couch has done exceptional work on this group, but look at the woven seat. The woven seat would appear to reference Native American basketry tradition. So here we have sort of Germanic and probably Cherokee cultures intertwining onto a single object today. And this kind of synchronicity can be seen as well in houses like this one, built for Joseph Van in what is now Murray County, Georgia, the Chief Van House, but the work of Cherokee and probably Moravian craftspeople, but very much also blending in aspects of Cherokee design and decorative arts. We see it in distinctive furniture forms, like punch tin decorated furniture, sort of ventilated furniture. I mean, seize like this would tend to fulfill an ancient need, which is basically, how do you keep food fresh in an era before refrigeration? And proper ventilation is key to that. You want moving air over your food, and you also want to keep bugs and vermin out. I mean, for example, this is a food safe in the collection of Colonial Williamsburg, in which linen is used to create that sort of semi-permeable surface. Punch tin is simply another way to address the same need. And it's a form we see throughout the American South, with the tins often decoratively punched in patterns that reflect other decorative arts traditions. And this, I love this photograph. This is a Greene County, Tennessee safe in the collection of Colonial Williamsburg. And I love that their photographer actually put lights inside of it to make it really visible to us, the patterns that are inside of it. And so, as I've said, as we look along the Wagon Road, we really see this progression and shifting of people. Here we have examples from Greene County, Tennessee, and Wythe County, Virginia. And I would, this is a particularly great example from Rockbridge County. I would encourage you, if you're interested in this form at all, to take a look at Jeff Evans and Kurt Russ's book on Virginia punch tin decorated furniture. I think Jeff may even be listening in on this. It's a wonderful, wonderful book. We see exuberant inlay in East Tennessee, like these two corner cupboards, and then the William Campbell desk and bookcase on the far right from Kentucky, from Madison County, not Tennessee. That's actually wrong. It should be Kentucky, not Tennessee. And you can learn more about Hugh McAdams and the inlay traditions of Washington County in this article by Amber Clausen in the MESDA Journal, including a group of important inlaid desks like these. Okay. So the final story I want to tell this afternoon in my final few moments is one about early Kentucky that really, I think, illustrates how new American forms are really born, coming through the valley, but then ultimately out the other side into the Trans-Appalachian West and into the Ohio River Valley. The 1810 census from Mason County, Kentucky, which is a port city on the Ohio River, across from Ohio, obviously, lists three cabinet makers, three cabinet makers, I should say, in the town of Lewisburg, which is just inland from the port. Gerard Calvert, John Foxworthy, and then at the bottom, we see the name Peter Tuttle. These three men were responsible for the creation of a style of furniture that became incredibly popular in that region. We know it became incredibly popular because today, and I'm so indebted to Mac Cox for his work on this slide and his work doing field work in the region, we've identified more than 100 examples from this group where you have this sort of fairly traditional, sometimes inlay, occasionally serpentine chest of drawers on the top, but always standing on these incredibly delicate little cabriole legs. And not just chests. We also see sugar desks. We see small stools. We see occasionally tables, blanket chests. But understanding why these look the way they do really comes back to that initial idea about people and place. Because we think about the Calvert family and the Tuttle family, the Foxworthy family, and they're all interrelated. Their journey begins in Prince William County, Virginia, on the Chesapeake Bay. They move down, up across the mountains, down the Ohio River to Maysville and to Washington and Lewisburg. But the Ohio River continues down to the Mississippi, and Mason County is really the place where the Anglo-Atlantic world and French Louisiana meet. And so as we think about the objects being made in Mason County, Kentucky, we need to also be thinking about the French and Spanish objects being made in Louisiana and how these two things really speak to each other. And in fact, how the pied de biche foot goes upstream while many of these Anglo-American inlay traditions, like that seen on this armoire, go downstream and create these new American styles. There is no doubt that as craftsmen and consumers move further away from the coast, that they also move further away from the sort of direct European-oriented styles found in places like Baltimore and Philadelphia. Their work begins to exhibit a kind of freedom that speaks to community, shared experiences, the materials they had access to, and also the demands of the consumers where they are. And they force us to ask the question, what do we really mean when we refer to something as being from the backcountry? What is backcountry furniture? It's certainly not backwards. It's certainly something that is more interesting, more freeing, more dynamic than just that. Take, for example, these chairs by William Challam of Lexington, Kentucky. Challam himself advertises that he has worked in both London and New York, and yet he finds his ultimate success making the kinds of things he made in those style centers, not along the coast, but in Lexington, Kentucky. Often we think about furniture, we think in terms of the old adage, good, better, best. And we can sort of expand this to a kind of bias in which it's good, better, best backcountry, as in it's good, better, best, and I don't know what it is, so it must be backcountry. But we really need to judge these objects on their own terms and recognize that they are not the result of a good, better, best dichotomy, trichotomy, but really are objects that deserve to be taken on their own terms as representations of the people and the places where they came from. They're neither backcountry or backwards, they're just different. And in those differences, we're allowed to really understand much more deeply how we came to be both the South of the past, but also the South of today. Thank you very much. And I'd be happy to take some questions if there's still time. You can put them in the chat, or you could ask them out loud.
Nobody has any questions at all.
I don't have any questions, but I have a comment.
Sure. Hey, Olivia, it's good to see you.
Hi, I wanted to tell everyone that I was the MESDA field representative for the lower Shenandoah Valley. My territory was from Weir's Cave, which is right above Stanton, all the way down to the Tennessee line. And I spent maybe a year and a half, maybe 2 years there. And I had a really great time and turned up some interesting things. Ironically, a lot of the things that I turned up were from Norfolk or from the eastern part of Virginia that had migrated back to the backcountry. But I can remember one instance. I went to a track house, just a ranch house in outside of Stanton, and the lady met me at the door and she said, "Step down." She didn't say hello. She didn't say, "How are you?" She just said, "Step down." And I stepped down, and there was a valley clock, complete with feet, which was unusual, but they had lowered the little entry hole so that they could fit the family clock in.
Oh, I love that. You know, I'm really glad you mentioned the MESDA research program, because this is actually the 50th anniversary of the field research program, which is this incredible project that is still ongoing, in which we actually, as a museum, go out and document these objects in their natural habitats. And when the project was in its early years, we would hire people like Olivia, who were, fresh-faced young college students, college graduates, And we basically send them out across the South, tell y'all to embed yourselves in communities and talk your way into strangers' houses to go see their objects, and then hopefully have a way of getting us back in there to do documentary photography. And the objects and the articles I referenced, those would not have been possible. I think all the authors would say those would not have been possible without the work of the MESDA Field Research Program going out there and finding these things. And you can now actually access all those files online. But there were probably about, in the early years, Olivia, maybe a dozen of y'all.
Well, not all at once. There were a dozen, but operating at once, we were about 5.
Okay.
And we would connect with each other a couple of times a year. It was really fun. we've
actually commissioned a writer and artist to put together a sort of interesting web article exhibit about the field research program, and I'll be sure to share a link with that once it's done. But it's a remarkable project, and one of the things I like about Anna's work on this, I'm not sure if you've talked to Anna, Olivia, or not, but she's really tried to recenter you all as creators, right? Not simply as sort of scientific observers, but actually really tried to recenter the program to celebrate the role y'all played in doing that work, because it's phenomenal. So thank you. And I see Sarah Bryan has a question about sulfur inlay, which is a great question. And the real expert on that, I have to say, is Lisa Minardi, who has written extensively about it in American Furniture and elsewhere. It's a tradition that appears to really materialize with no real close European precedent in Lancaster, Pennsylvania, among the German-speaking Mennonite communities there. That's where the earliest examples seem to survive. And then over time, it sort of moves outward with a cluster of objects in the Shenandoah Valley, particularly Shenandoah County, and then another cluster of objects in Piedmont, North Carolina. And it's such an interesting technique, and it makes a lot of sense if you think about it. I mean, it's a material that's certainly in its freshest state when it's produced is almost ivory-like in its appearance. And there's some videos. If you just go to YouTube, you can also see some wonderful videos of people doing it and demonstrating how to do it. I will warn you, if you're a woodworker and want to do it on your own, it's perfectly safe, but you will smell like rotten eggs for a very long time afterwards.
Dan, I have a question, which is
Sure.
I was struck by the sophistication both of design and decoration of a lot of the pieces that you showed us tonight. Is there also a less sophisticated and less decorative tradition?
Yeah, there absolutely is. So, one of the biases we have in museums is we tend to collect what survives, and what survives tend to be the more elite of objects. I think one of the best places to see this more vernacular work are in things like chair traditions, which tend to be much simpler, more vernacular, and tend to have some decent survival rate, probably because there are just so many of them. So, a lower percentage might have survived, but it's a lower percentage of a larger number. I think also things like punch tin decorated furniture are really becoming much more appreciated, even though they are very much utilitarian kind of forms. But there is also this really sophisticated material as well. So there is a great deal of variation, and there is a lot more study now, especially of the more vernacular materials.
I'm not sure whether I should confess to the fact that my parents in 1947, after they got married, had a punch tin meat safe that they put on the north-facing back wall of their flat in London.
There you go.
Which is not that long ago.
Yeah. They're very practical.
Daniel, can I ask a question? Please.
Sure.
You referred to Fraktur. if I've said that right, Fraktur.
Yes.
You had up a screen of, yes, what looked like, oh, I don't know if they're paintings or embroideries or what, but very decorative. So what are they?
Fraktur is our blanket term we use for, well, in German are called, I'm going to mispronounce this, Tafelschein, but these are sort of calligraphy documents often found in German-speaking communities, usually celebrating births, baptisms, marriages, sometimes deaths.
Thank you. Yeah, I get it. Right. I mean, for UK
tradition
frozen for the UK audience.
executed on
You back. Dan, could I just ask a question? What is a tobacco desk?
I think we've lost him, or he's
Yes.
frozen.
I think he's frozen.
Let me have a look. See if
I was-
Hey, I think I just lost y'all for a brief second, but I think I'm back.
Go back, you are. I would like to add something, Daniel.
Sure, Jeff.
I did a study on Shenandoah Valley vernacular chairs before I helped do the Pie Safe book, and back to the vernacular chairs. I was able to discover a very interesting group of rail spindle back chairs coming out of Augusta County that were based exactly on the British regional chairs of the same. Now, I think they were from the Midlands, or I forget exactly where that style was coming out of England. But and the way they changed is that the ones in the valley were being made with a turned finial, like a lemon shape ovoid finial, which differentiated them from the British chairs, but otherwise they looked exactly the same. And of course, Daniel talked about the British, settling in, or the Scotch-Irish settling in Augusta County, and that's where all these chairs that I was able to recover and identify were coming out of. So that's really a strong example of that British regional tradition coming in.
Thanks for that, Jeff. Yeah, it's interesting to see how in some cases these traditions really begin to adapt and change over time, and how in other cases they really persist. And I think chairs are one of those places where you can kind of see both happening in different areas, different speeds. So, and I'll say as well, David Dewing and I are working on an American trip, hopefully in 2024 for the Regional Furniture Society. And I'll put you on the spot here, but Jeff, I think we want to come see your chair collection.
Absolutely. You better plan to spend the day. We may look at a few safes too, etc.
Could I?
Sorry. Okay. Go ahead.
Could I ask a question, Dan?
Sure.
It's just an observation, really, but it's very interesting to hear you talk about furniture in America, and such a lot of it seems to be very highly provenanced. And of course, the difficulty with studies of English regional furniture is that most of it's really not very well provenanced to particular makers, unless they've actually put a mark on the furniture which indicates who they are and where they came from. And so the vast majority of furniture that we deal with is not known about. And somehow you seem to find an awful lot of examples where you can precisely say who made it and where they came from, and you can map where their origins were, and you can trace where they. Is that because their descendants have settled and stayed in the same place, that there's much less social mobility, there's people who have just stayed in the same areas? Sounds like a very rural community where perhaps economic change hasn't happened very much, and they've just remained in the same place, and perhaps in the same house, and so they've got the same furniture there that their great grandfathers had made for themselves. Is that how it works?
Well, I would say first, our collection and the collections I draw on tend to be highly biased. A lot of things, I always joke, one of our big jobs is we reunite orphaned objects with the communities and people where they came from. a lot of the objects we collect, we really prize having that provenance with. So for every object I show, there are many, many more that do not have those kinds of histories. And I think we prioritize that in the field research project as well, because it only takes one or two objects with really firm provenances to help then reunite things that have lost them. I think there is actually quite a bit of migration, though objects don't always migrate with people, and so they stay behind. So, for a given family, there may be many generations of mobility, but there's that one branch that stays put. And those are the kinds of people that we would send Olivia and the other field researchers to go find. One of the big changes in how we do field research today versus the past is that now 30, 40, 50 years on, a lot of those objects have finally sort of slipped out of those original places and instead are now in the hands of collectors who are really passionate about collecting particular small parts of the world. And so, now rather than trying to go find, the old family and the spinster aunt who's never left, we're instead looking at collectors who have over the past 25 years or so been doing that kind of work and really carefully reporting provenance when they retrieve things. Because so many things have left their original context. And, once you've lost that, it's really hard to get that back. But I am definitely giving a biased view just based on the collections I work with. But I think that actually illustrates the importance and the power of having those kinds of connections.
Yeah, thank you.
Right. Well,
Dan, I did post a question. Don't you see it?
I think I just saw it pop up here. That's actually a really, I would love to know more about that, because I don't think your question is about fluted quarter columns, Northwest England, and related to Catholic traditions, which I don't think we see here, but I'm really fascinated by the fact that that's a thing in the UK.
Well, it's speculative. There certainly are a lot of quarter columns on both Northwest clocks and Northwest chests, and some are plain and some are fluted. And I think there's evidence that Gillows did quite a bit with fluted columns as well. So there's some evidence of a prevalence of quarter columns in the Northwest. And the question is why? And they are fairly ornate and decorative, and there was a feeling that it was a strong recusant area. It might have been influenced by that, but I'm not sure it's well founded. And I was curious if there was any work had been done on quarter columns in the US and which social groups used them. Because if it turned out it was particular groups in the US used quarter columns, that would be enlightening for both sides of the pond.
Yeah, I mean, the particular examples that I showed today were all coming out of the sort of Quaker traditions in the northern part of the valley. So definitely not Catholic.
Well, there are quite a few Quakers in the Northwest as well, so maybe that's
there you go.
line to pursue.
Yeah,
it was quite strong in the Northwest of England. Okay, so a topic for the future.
absolutely.
I'm going to ask you.
Sure.
The beautifully painted chests in the Shenandoah Valley, in what sense are they connected to the Frakturs of the population there, which are similarly beautifully painted? But are the motifs in both interchangeable?
We do see a repetition of motifs. We also believe that in some cases that the same artists are doing both. That the cabinet maker and the decorator aren't necessarily the same person, and that there may be some overlap between Fraktur artists and furniture painters, but there are definitely overlaps in terms of iconography.
Exactly, but of course they both are symbolic, aren't they?
Absolutely, yep.
They both have narratives of their own. And is there a study on the difference between the narratives?
Yes, I mean, so there are a number of scholars who've done work on that. I mean, Lisa Minardi comes to mind, Jeff Evans, and his work in the Shenandoah Valley, Betsy Davison, who's working on a book on Johannes Spitler, who's probably the best known of the Southern, certainly of the Virginia paint decorators. And then in terms of Fraktur studies, but I think it's really in the most recent generation we've begun kind of reading these media together, as opposed to, the Fraktur people are over here doing their thing and the paint decorated furniture people are over here.
Sure.
But being much more holistic about it.
Right. I think we should draw to a close. I'm just looking at the time, and you've been speaking for quite a long while. So there was one further question from Jeremy Bate about what was a tobacco chest?
Tobacco chest. That's a great question. I think I probably meant to say a sugar desk is probably what I meant to say.
Right.
And a sugar desk is a particular form of furniture used for storing sugar. Generally, we see them in Tennessee and Kentucky. What makes a sugar desk is from the outside, it very much looks like a fall front desk. But when you open it up, there's sort of a big compartment divided into at least two sections used for storing sugar. And there's, it's a very desirable, very distinctive regional style. And I see we have a hand up as well.
Well, now that you have said that, I recall that Hans Pienaar, in one of the talks that he did last year, was telling us that in Holland there are similar desks that were used for grain storage. And so I wonder whether there is a Dutch influence there, because they fold out to show similarly compartments in which you can keep your grain.
Yeah.
Yes.
Come on, just say it.
Yeah, can I just say that when we did a trip to the Netherlands, there is a great history, particularly in the Friesland area, of painted furniture. And I just wondered where you tracked any Dutch settlements, like you've tracked the Germans and where all the other folks. And I just wondered if you tracked the Dutch.
Not in as detailed a way, mostly because they just, I think the biggest example of Dutch settlement in the South, top of my head, and Dutch, not Deutsch, not German speaking, but actual Dutch. There's some settlement in the Chesapeake Bay region up in Maryland in the late 17th century. But there's less sort of direct migration, so.
Thank you.
Okay, can we draw this to a close? This has been terrific. I mean, thank you so much, Daniel. I think we've shown how much interest there is across the pond, and let's do this again. This has been
absolutely. It's been a pleasure seeing everybody, and I'm glad to be able to bring these two groups, sort of the MESDA group and the RFS group together for this, and I hope many more people will have an opportunity to watch the video as well.
Indeed. Right. So thank you. Right.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you.
Good afternoon. Yes.
Good. Yes.